That report released yesterday shows $82,000 in undocumented overtime and salaries in excess amounts fixed by the Lake County Council. Certain employees received overtime compensation as a regular bi-weekly increment, the same amount being paid each pay period. Other employees received no overtime pay until the end of the year. This is not consistent with payroll practices generally required to be followed by governmental entities, since overtime compensation should have been claimed and paid in the payroll period in which it was earned. In a letter directed to the State Board of Accounts dated June 23rd of this year, Dr. Willardo says, "I did delegate all authority of administration of the budget to my Chief Deputy, Charles Smith. I did not directly in any way oversee the weekly preparation of the payroll to the employees," further stating that, to the best of my knowledge, no guidelines were set for overtime payments by the State Board of Accounts or the County Council. It is my sincere feeling that reviewing the total payments to the employees and the amount of work done, there is no obvious abuse.
We've got 3 helicopters out here, and Hughes Corporation, who manufactures these, said that we got a value of somewhere around $200,000, and it cost the county nothing. It didn't cost them a penny to get them. It's our expense to go down and get them. We've assembled them, and we've got all 3 of them here running with less than $10,000 expense. We would like to get a turbine helicopter, which is a 4-place helicopter, which would allow us to get from one end of the county to the other in a matter of 5 minutes. They fly in excess of 160 miles an hour. They'll hold 2 litters, so evacuation type thing. We can hold 2 litter patients. Anyway, we've got a range of somewhere around 400 miles with this thing. The power is just unbelievable. The reason we selected to use 500 is because the fact that it's 20% better fuel consumption than any of its competitors.
Well, we got a campaign kickoff to go down to the Public Service Commission to ask the Public Service Commission for a rate reduction for all the customers of NIPSCO, for the simple fact that we've been out now in our 11th week of the strike, and we figure that the company has saved approximately $25 million. And we feel that this $25 million should be returned to the customers in reduced utility bills. They spend that money, and there is no savings. Well, you know, how can you go to work and have 4,300 people off the job and say that you're not saving money if you were paying wages to all those people?
Over the intervening 18 months until about the present time, the only cases we were seeing were animals that were involved in specialty shows, dog shows as it were. Then, about 4 to 5 weeks ago, from being no problem, it became a massive problem. we're probably seeing 10 to 15 cases a day, and I'd have to say it's literally reached epidemic proportions. If you catch it early, our success in treating the disease has been fairly rewarding, even in the younger animals if we catch it early. If the animals come in extremely dehydrated and with profusely bloody diarrhea, then our treatment isn't nearly as successful. There's several vaccines available at the moment. Parvacine, which is a killed panleukopenia or killed feline distemper vaccine, they have about 5 to 6 million doses back ordered at this point. There's only one lab in the country that's making it at this point. The shipments are sporadic, so we're advising all our clients, I would advise all the people watching this to contact their veterinarian periodically, maybe every several days, because they've been doling out a few doses at a time.
We have what I would call an emergency water shortage, to the extent that there's times that the groundwater or the elevated tank is empty and we don't have enough water pressure or water storage for fire protection. Probably in the last 4 or 5 years we've doubled our population. We're now around 13,000, and we not necessarily doubled the population in that short period, but we've doubled the water consumption because of the new lawns, the new buildings. The population has went from around 8,000 to 13,000, and these are all new buildings which require a high consumption of water during the dry periods of the year.
Beekler says it has taken lots of convincing to show town officials the need for an emergency 1.5 million gallon underground storage tank.
Certainly is. I think if you'd been to any of the executive board meetings or town board meetings, I pleaded within the last 3 years with the boards to try to alleviate this problem, and they've had very difficult periods to sometimes sell it to the public and to get it financed, and it takes a long time between the time of trying to decide to do this before the time you have it online, and we're talking about close to 3 years now.
A good time being had by all. Why don't you come out and join us at the Lake County Fair? I'm Rex Havlin, Channel 50 News.
Well, the main reason is the last few years, since 1976, the law has only been required for first graders to have a complete immunization record. So because of that, the last few years, the major outbreaks of measles and other diseases are occurring in the junior and senior high schools. So we're trying to get the older kids up to date too.
And what happens if a student is not popularly immunized?
Well, that's up to the school superintendents. By law, they have to be by November 1st. However, children can be excluded from school all the way through high school if the immunizations aren't complete. The worst problem we're having is with the older parents of older children not having any records at all. and we're encouraging them to try to find who the doctor was, when they were young children, try to find the records, or see if the school would have anything at all on them. So it's very difficult getting records from 10 or 20 years back.
Look at me. Let me give you Chris. Look at the baby. Chris. That's all. That's all. Oh, boy. Oh, you're a big girl. Now, Missy, go sit down. Missy. You okay?
My only government action was on behalf of the United States, not on behalf of Libya. In November 1979, Rosalind called me at home and asked if I thought I could talk to somebody from Libya about getting help on the release of the hostages held in Iran. I agreed to try and went to Washington the next day. Before approaching any Libyan, I talked to Dr. Brzezinski and Secretary of State Vance and obtained their approval. I then called Dr. El-Huderi and was told that he was out of town. I returned home and came back about a week later, met with Dr. El-Huderi, and arranged a meeting between him and Dr. Brzezinski. I was asked to attend that meeting and in turn asked Randy Coleman, who had come to Washington with me, to go also. It was a short meeting in which Dr. Brzezinski asked if the Libyan government would try to help in gaining the release of the hostages in Iran. This was my first, last, and only action with the United States government as to Libyan policy, and was done only after I obtained permission from Secretary of State Vance. Mr. Chairman, I hope this testimony will show in common sense fashion that Billy Carter is not a buffoon, a boob, or a wacko, as some public figures have so described him. I am a common citizen with uncommon financial and family problems. I want to restore order to my life, but obviously cannot do so until I've assisted all investigations who wish my president.
That's amazing energy. He still looks fantastic. I had a night off the night I arrived, and they called, and what was so marvelous about it is they just didn't invite me. They said, bring your cast with you. Now, it could have been a cast of 60, but they loved actors, and we had the greatest night of my life. The first one's the most challenging because they have not seen the first two plays. It's very talky. We have long monologues that Neil's famous for doing, and it's the most difficult. The second one is very physical and lots of fun, and the last one, I think, is my favorite that Neil's ever written. I think people identify, so if they ever had a daughter married and spent a lot of money. And I think the audience really identifies with it more than the other two. I don't have one. Someone must have left it.
Well, the general idea is that companies that get more than their marginal profit from the black community and have not chosen to have blacks on their boards of directors, they have not chosen to put money in our banks, they have not chosen to put investable funds in black banks, and insurance companies, they have not used black products and goods and services. They have not hired black people vertically and horizontally. And if they expect a continuing relationship with us, they must change their policies. Those companies that fall into that category are the companies that we are simply going to confront. We have begun to mobilize ministers' conferences around the nation, and that's why today we're spending our focus on mobilizing each other before we name those that we're going to confront. So once we cast our net, no fish will be able to escape.
that when Chicago came into our jurisdiction and inspected some of Hammond's facilities, this was done without notice to Hammond personnel. We had no one to take the opportunity to go along on the inspection. It was done without our authorization, although authorization would have been granted. If Chicago had a problem with Hammond or alleged that there was a problem, the proper protocol would have been to notify Hammond officials and make a joint inspection, or to turn it over to an agency which has superior jurisdiction, namely the U.S. EPA, and allowed this impartial third party to come in and make the investigation. Lastly, there is some question whether or not the city of Chicago did take any samples whatsoever of any of the material that was located in the Hammond pumping station. If they did take material, again, this would have violated common procedure in which you would have had to take a sample simultaneously, or what's more commonly known as a split sample between the two. So two labs could then make the determination of whether or not the material was the same material as in the lakefront.
Last week, I reported on the weak black political leadership and the call for their replacement. This week, we follow up on that report. At the Democratic Convention, President Carter had only 300 votes over what he needed to win the nomination. So the 480 black delegates could have withheld their support to win concessions from Jimmy Carter. Black leaders demanded that the president meet with their delegation before the convention ended. They further demanded that he name a black as a top White House aide and, of course, support the $12 million jobs package. The president rejected their demands and gave in only on the $12 billion jobs plank in the platform as an appeasement to the Kennedy supporters and not the black leaders. Some independent black leaders proposed a walkout to dramatize their unhappiness. Little did they know that the Carter-Mondale re-election staffers were telephoning black leaders now benefiting from federal funds and demanded that they denounce the walkout. What black leader from Lake County do you think they called to put a damper on the protest? Well, immediately, Jesse Jackson, a leader of national black boycotts and protests, expediently said it would be a national disgrace to walk out, and has announced he is leading a boycott of selected major business corporations. Detroit Mayor Coleman Young sounded the Democratic strategy, saying blacks should not walk out because they would have no place to go but to Ronald Reagan. Representative Curtis Collins said, at this late date, we have to look beyond presidential politics and organize. So one at a time, the black leaders found reasons to stay and vote for Jimmy Carter. Senator Richard Newhouse from Illinois walked out alone, charging, blacks have been had again. We quoted an official last week, and it's worth reporting again this week. It's time to look for new blood, new leadership. I'm Bob Freeland. That's the Inside Report.
little sore. Ankles are a little sore, but outside of that, I feel pretty good.
You seem like you had a little trouble getting the foot braces on when you started. They took it off and replaced it once. Were you having some trouble with your leg pads?
Yeah, because of my pads that I had wrapped around my ankles, prevented it from going on. So we changed our rope design totally off, and it just messed everything up. I thought I was going to fall out up there.
But you made it.
Yeah.
We have an unofficial time of what, 3.7?
Well, I have 3 timers, and one time was like 3.5. One time was, well, I have 2 3.5s, a 3.8, and a 3.1. And the record's 8.5. And so I broke the record, I think.
Well, the money's pretty good, you know, and you get a good view of the area around, you know. It was a little hazy today, but at least it wasn't raining. About the worst thing that can happen is to have one of the big lights in the top broken, and then you can't get it out except by reaching way down inside of it with a pair of pliers and ripping it out, basically. You can't really have a close call, you know. You only get one chance. That's about it.
The completion date for Genesis Center has been tentatively set for February 1st. The structure, located in downtown Gary, across the street from the Sheraton Hotel, is the proposed site for conventions, banquets, and sporting events to be held in Gary. Several Gary civic leaders met with John Davey of the Indiana Department of Tourism to discuss various promotional campaigns and determine the feasibility of their options. Their main consideration in ensuring full booking at the center will be to attract tourists to Gary. A generally expressed hope among those present is that the projected increase of tourists will also increase the city's revenue. Kathy Talenko, Channel 50 News.
I don't believe there's any Hammond sewage in there whatsoever from the information I have gathered. I think what has happened is that when you compare the size of the city of Hammond's treatment facility versus the Chicago metropolitan, you are basically comparing David to Goliath. The quantity of discharge from any overflows from their source system and their sanitary sewers would be of a greater magnitude. I mean, you're talking of a city of 3 million population, and you're talking of Hammond with 100,000, and even if you were to include Hammond's contract users, I don't believe you're anywhere, shape, or form come close to the amount of discharge. Secondly, even if Hammond were pumping directly into the lake, the quantity of what Hammond would be if they were to bypass their total system would just be a drop in the bucket compared to the quantity of water that would be evolved between here and Chicago. So the dilution factor alone, based upon Hammond's discharge, is just monumental. So it would have to be a very large discharger. I believe what has happened here is Chicago has been the recipient of its own discharge problems, and that we are now confusing some of the material that may have gotten to the southern end of the lake because of the flow, combining with some industrial type discharges and contaminating those industrial discharges, and then laying the blame on those particular industrial discharges as coming from Hammond.
We have a hotline that we're trying to organize right now. It's a series of phone lines to all the law enforcement agencies that we have throughout the country, nationwide. And we feel, if this thing, if it gets off the ground, that when there is a particular drug that's becoming a menace and hurting a lot of kids on the street in a particular area of the nation, as it's coming towards us, this hotline could be a determining factor for us to be prepared for this tragedy, for whatever epidemic may come with this particular drug. We can do this in turn to that particular area through the same kind of hotline. Say this drug was originating from, say, south, and it came to us. Every little area would have a central location, a red phone, so to speak. Okay, and with that design in mind, we would be able to communicate with all these other agencies and just to combat this thing much quicker, rather than find somebody that has had an overdose of this particular, a new drug or something new on the market that's coming out, killing these kids, and then finding out how we could have prevented it with an autopsy. Well, then it's too late. All we're talking about right now is time. There's a time element. We're going to speed up a process of combating this thing before it even gets to our kids. We know it's coming in. We know what to expect. They may even be able to give us a link through the communication which we're talking about as to the route that this is taking. Say it's coming through the northern part of Illinois or the southern part of Illinois into our area. Or say it's going from the west coast and it's going to swing around towards the Gulf of Mexico and come towards us. We are aware. And rather than going through communiques and the Drug Enforcement Administration, which does a marvelous job anyway, but it's just a matter of time. It will speed up. Our whole initiative as far as fighting or combating whatever new drug is on the market.
U.S. Senator Richard Lugar announced today that in keeping with his 1976 campaign promise, he will open a local office in the main post office branch on Soule Avenue in Hammond September 8th. According to the senator, this is the first office he has opened outside of his Washington and Indianapolis offices. The function of it will be to focus on problems and needs of Northwest Indiana residents and to provide them with an outlet for dealing with federal agencies. The office will be headed by Lugar's special assistant Tim Sanders and manned by special volunteers. According to Sanders, the office will be open on a 9-to-5 basis with telephone answering service provided for after hours.
Well, we're opening it now largely because Tim Sanders is available, has served, we believe, an apprenticeship that has been outstanding during the past year. It seemed to us important before we moved that we had the full cooperation of the leadership of Lake County and Porter County, and we had some liaison problems, diplomatic problems with St. Joe County and Elkhart County and a number of counties in the Northwest, all of whom had some feel that the office ought to be located there. That has not been the easiest situation to try to work through, and it's taken some time. It appeared to me that prior to having both the man selected and the site selected, that I ought to touch base, and I have done so, and also tried to feel our way as to how we would work this situation with our Washington office and with Indianapolis. It's the first time we've attempted it.
Kathy Tulenko, Channel 50 News.
I have today announced the formation of a task force to study the need for toughening our lobby disclosure law. The art of legislating is an attempt to resolve questions among competing interests. Lobbying is critical to that process. It provides the legislator and the governor with needed technical information, and it also provides such policymakers with the views of particular constituencies. However, the public also needs to know about the climate in which lobbying takes place. A good lobby disclosure act should include the following elements. It should enable the legislators and the public to understand more fully the extent of lobbying efforts. It should improve public confidence in the legislative process by removing unjustified suspicions of improper behavior and by giving the public greater insight into that legislative process. It should provide a method of policing unethical conduct. It should enhance the reputation of the lobbying profession by removing the secrecy surrounding its activities.
The mentally ill law passed in the winter of 1980 goes into effect today. We spoke with Lake County Prosecutor Jack Crawford to discuss the law and its effect upon the court system. Mentally ill law passed in the winter of 1980 goes into effect today. We spoke with Lake County Prosecutor Jack Crawford to discuss the law and its effect upon the court system.
The guilty but mentally ill law makes two important changes in Indiana criminal law. Number one, if a defendant pleads not guilty by reason of insanity, the jury will be given the option, an option they did not have under the prior law, of finding the defendant to be mentally ill and still finding him to be guilty. In other words, still holding him accountable and responsible for his actions. The result of a verdict of guilty but mentally ill will be that the criminal defendant will be sentenced to a mental institution for a period of time during which he will receive mental treatment. After the mental treatment is completed, and if, in the opinion of the psychiatrist, he is then deemed cured of his mental illness, the defendant will not be released, but rather will be transferred to a prison to serve out the remainder of his term. This is an important and significant change in Indiana law, that an individual may be mentally ill, but still may be held accountable for his actions. It allows juries to both provide mental treatment for a criminal defendant and at the same time to provide and ensure for protection of the community against individuals who may commit further dangerous acts. Secondly, the new legislation provides that the ultimate decision as to the release of a person found insane, which is still available under the new law, will be up to a judge and not up to the psychiatrist. Under the old law, the final decision rested in the hands of the doctors, the psychiatrist, at the state mental institution, and Indiana law is replete with case after case where individuals have been released back onto the street who are still dangerous and who go on to commit further violent acts and yet have been determined by psychiatrists to be sane enough to be returned to the community. From now on, that decision is going to be made by the criminal justice system and not by the psychiatric community.
The state statute 19-1-25, section 3 and 4 states that the police commission, the Metropolitan Police Commission, has the authority to set the budget and salaries, and the town board has to meet these salaries. In the town budget, it states that the police department or police officers shall not exceed a 2.5% salary increase. No other place in the budget is to state that other town employees shall not get this, only in the police department's budget.
Well, the board adopted a policy that 2.5% would be the cost of living increase in the town, and I presume that will apply to all employees. I have heard some of the figures the police department quoted, and the information that they quoted was incorrect. The 2.5% would apply to all employees.
So even yourself will receive 2.5%.
Yes.
Where are they getting this information, and that some are receiving 25%?
I think they're misreading the budget. Salaries in the budget are presented in ranges, and then an individual employee has a step on that range, a particular grade, and some of the ranges have changed. That does not necessarily mean that the actual salary received by the employee in that range has changed beyond the 2.5%.
Gary Mayor Richard Hatcher announced today the U.S. Conference of Mayors welcomes President Carter's Economic Renewal Program. According to Hatcher, who is president of the Conference of Mayors, 8 out of the 11 anti-recession measures unanimously endorsed by the organization are included in the program. Hatcher feels the package offers hope by giving some relief from the recession to the poor and unemployed. In speaking for the group, he says they will support the White House's pledge to seek $1 billion in counter-cyclical funds for 1981 and an additional 13 weeks of unemployment. He also expressed the hope that local officials will be represented on the President's proposed Economic Revitalization Board. Kathy Talenko, Channel 50 News.
Well, it could be really significant for our area and for all the individual counties in the state, because right now it's the local counties and our local property taxpayers that pay most of the operating budget for courts. All the state pays right now is part of the judge's salary. Your secretaries, your court reporters, your bailiffs, and the other court personnel and all the supplies are all paid out of local expense. And if the state picks up more of the expense of the operation of the courts, it's going to free up funds in the budget for other uses.
You're an old political pro. You've been in the business for a long time. Usually in September, the third-party candidacies fall apart. And in the last 2 or 3 weeks, John Anderson's candidacy has gone from a popularity in the polls from 21% down to, I think it's 15 or 14%. As it moves into October and people see that vote as a losing vote, they'll jump toward either Carter or Reagan, don't you think?
If that trend continues, but the fact is the trend has already been reversed.
Reversed downward, though, huh?
We had 21% before the conventions. Then we had 25 hours of free prime time for Reagan in Detroit, and then 25 hours of free prime time for Carter in New York, and it was not surprising that the Anderson vote was down in the mid-teens. But the fact is that that is reversed already. In fact, Mr. Roper, who had him down at 13%, now has him up to 17%. And I just have no doubt that we will meet the standards set by the League of Women Voters for the debates.
most recent economic indicators in Indiana and the job statistics show that there is over 12% unemployment in the state of Indiana. Now that is a disgrace. That is totally unacceptable. And the reason that we have double-digit unemployment is because of the irresponsible policies that have been emanating from our nation's capital, from the administration, and more particularly from the United States Congress. And as I have said many times before, and I'm sure that Doug will agree with me, that we have got to change that United States Congress to get this road back on economic recovery and to have job opportunities. And we are campaigning for the future, and today a 5-point plan that I've announced, and Bob Orr is announcing a similar plan, and we'll be up here to announce his plan tomorrow, is this. We've got to have fiscal reform, we've got to have tax reform, we've got to have monetary reform, we've got to have regulatory reform, and we've got to have a viable energy policy in this country.
We're talking to Wes Booker, the Republican County Chairman from Porter County. We understand that Mr. Quayle, who's a Republican candidate for the office of Senator for the state of Indiana, was in Porter County yesterday. We understand that he will be back again tomorrow. The purpose of his visit, can you tell us what he did?
Sure, Bob. Dan was in about an hour and a half yesterday, had a news conference. The purpose of his visit was to outline the Republican approach to jobs. And as you know, Lake and Porter County have one of the highest unemployment rates in the state of Indiana, and so it's a critical issue up in our area. Bob Orr and John Mutz, our candidate for governor and lieutenant governor, along with the national Republican congressman and Dan Quayle for U.S. Senate, have all an approach, a unified approach, as to solving this problem and creating jobs. Jobs along with the tax cut and some of the things that we need to do now to get our nation moving again.
Mr. Booker, is the thrust of this campaign, the Republicans who are the incumbents in the State House, is the thrust of that campaign to be directed toward the unemployment in the blue-collar areas of this state?
In our state, the jobs picture is more or less a national issue and not so much of a state issue. The unemployment, it's caused by the steel and the automobile industry that are two big employers in our state. But the thrust of the Republicans in the state is, number one, is let's put the people back to work and work with them in Washington. And then number two is to keep Indiana the lowest state in the nation as far as the tax cuts or the tax that we have, which has been a Governor Bowen's proposal and a Republican-sponsored proposal through the state through the years.
In the last 6 months, the first 6 months of 1980, at least 61,000 Hoosiers have lost their jobs to the Carter Recession. That's a significant number, and I think it tells a story about what's been caused by the Carter Recession. It has hurt Indiana, Mr. Carter's recession has, and hurt it deeply. It could not be otherwise, since his disastrous economic policies jumped unemployment in Indiana from 5.2% in October of 1976 to a figure of 11.5% today, more than double. It's hurt us in terms of the prime interest rate, 6.25% at this time in 1976. We all know it went to 20% in April. It's back down to what Jimmy Carter says is a low at 11.5%, with lots of talk of it's going back up again. Inflation, 4.8%. Just before the election in 1976, it's been up to 20%. It's down to someplace in the neighborhood of 12% right now. Those statistics tell a story. And yet I know with absolute certainty that the job-creating initiatives that we have developed in pursuit of successful conclusions here in Indiana, day in and day out during the last 7.5 years, have helped to cushion things here in Indiana so that we can weather Mr. Carter's stop and go, start, stop, and restart economic schemes.
Local United Steelworkers leaders announced today their agenda for a workshop to be held at the Gary Sheraton Hotel. The conference, consisting of 4 separate sessions, will be geared toward problems such as chemical waste, nuclear power, and oil shortages.
Our district, District 31 United Steelworkers, like the rest of the Steelworkers Union, has been concerned about these issues for a long time. We are concerned about protecting our environment for two reasons. First, as residents of our community, we want a clean and healthy environment for ourselves, our friends, our family, and neighbors. Second, it seems too often now that many corporations will adopt and attempt to postpone pollution controls as long as possible. The resulting health damage and environment destruction eventually must be stopped. Energy is also a deep concern of our union. Our members suffer doubly under the rising cost of energy as consumers and as workers. And we're going to have experts from all over the country come in. They have a lot of experience in other situations, in other areas of how they handle the problem so that they can bring some of that wisdom to us.
Jobs, energy, and the environment will be the issues discussed at a two-day workshop sponsored by the United Steelworkers Union, District 31, Friday and Saturday. According to Director James Balanoff, the workshop will feature experts discussing alternative solutions to the energy crisis in this area. The major topic to be covered will be mass transportation, its effect upon the environment and the workforce. This is Kathy Talenko for Channel 50 News.
NIPSCO is trying to use the building trades to bust our union. Are contracting out our work, and that we've asked the building trades to support us in our efforts to negotiate a decent contract and keep from doing work that has normally been done by our employees. And with the building trades cooperation, we can get this strike ended in a pretty hastily manner. But so far, the building trades have refused. Have crossed our picket lines on numerous occasions to do work that we normally do.
It's a crackdown to resolve a 21% delinquency rate by traffic offenders in Gary City Court who have failed to show up. City officials and the Lake County Prosecutor's Office have admitted that traffic offenders simply can't take the city court and a traffic ticket seriously.
I think many individuals who receive a traffic ticket, and we've all received one at one time or another, usually don't take the time to read that traffic ticket. But if they did, they would notice that the uniform traffic ticket is styled in the form of a criminal information or a criminal charge, listing all the elements of the charge, listing the name of the defendant, listing the circumstances of the charge. And right at the bottom, the last thing that you have on your uniform traffic ticket, which the police officer will ask you to sign when you receive it, is something called a promise to appear. Very few persons read it, but it says at the bottom, I promise to appear at said court at said time and place. And beneath that is the signature of the person receiving the traffic ticket. And this language means exactly what it says. It is a promise to appear. Under the laws of the state of Indiana, a traffic ticket such as this allows the police officer and the court to accept your promise to appear rather than your cash in the form of a bond or a surety bond as posted by a bondsman. This is a special provision allowed to traffic offenders, with the understanding that traffic offenders perhaps are not as serious as some of our other criminal violators.
As of today, the city court is changing its tactics. For traffic offenders, the court now says it will go after all those who fail to show up in court.
I'm going to take the position that individuals who do not appear in this court on the dates that they have promised to appear, then one, I will issue a bench warrant for their arrest. If those individuals are arrested, they will remain in jail until their case is tried, or, based upon the circumstances, they will be allowed to post bond. For those individuals who find themselves in those circumstances, I will ask the prosecutor's office to file criminal charges against them for failure to appear. It is a separate and distinct offense. It is, in fact, a Class A misdemeanor, the highest misdemeanor that we have under the law of the state of Indiana, which carries a maximum 1 year in jail and a $5,000 fine.
Negotiations for a three-way debate among presidential candidates reached an impasse today. The League of Women Voters says it's preparing for a September 21st debate in Baltimore without President Carter. Yesterday, the League decided to allow independent candidate John Anderson to join Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter in the fall presidential debates. That was just fine with Reagan and Anderson. But Carter officials are still holding out for an initial one-on-one debate between Carter and Reagan. And if Anderson is in, Carter is out. The League of Women Voters says what they still plan to go ahead with the September 21st Baltimore debate, whether Carter chooses to show up or not. Reagan is now saying he is wondering whether President Carter really wants a one-on-one debate with anyone. Anderson says no matter what, public anger will force Carter to join in on the debates. Carter so far has avoided commenting on the debates. That's the Inside Report. I'm Bob Freeland.